Hi there. Good morning. Hello. Oh my goodness. This is fantastic. So Wellness, my most recent book, came out about a year ago, and I've been touring all over the US, all over Europe, for pretty consistently for about a year. And this is my final event for Wellness. Yes, the last one. I'm actually going to go write another book now. So I couldn't be happier to be spending my last event here with all of you. My wife and I have lived in Naples, Florida for a very long time, so we've traveled to Key West a lot. The first time we ever came to Key West, my wife took me here to celebrate my 30th birthday, and which was a considerably more debaucherous night than I'm having this trip. Which is kind of why I thought, well, it's Key West. There's nobody going to be showing up at 9:30 in the morning on a weekend. So I thought there would be about 8 people in the room this morning. So this is such a thrill. So thank you, all of you, for coming out so early to hear us talk. Thank you to the seminar, and Arlo, and everybody on your team for making this such a beautiful experience. And I thought I would read the first chapter of Wellness, and then talk about the book a little bit, kind of where it came from and what I was going for, and then leave some time at the end for questions, because that's honestly my favorite part. And so if you have any questions, keep them in your head, and we'll have time for that at the end. But here's the first chapter of Wellness. He lives alone on the 4th floor of an old brick building with no view of the sky. When he looks out his window, all he can see is her window, across the alley, an arm's length away, where she lives alone on the 4th floor of her own old building. They don't know each other's names. They have never spoken. It is winter in Chicago. Barely any light enters the narrow alley between them, and barely any rain either, or snow, or sleet, or fog, or that crackling, wet January stuff the locals call wintry mix. The alley is dark and still and without weather. It seems to have no atmosphere at all, a hollow stitched into the city for the singular purpose of separating things from things, like outer space. She first appeared to him on Christmas Eve. He'd gone to bed early that night, feeling horribly sorry for himself, the only soul in his whole raucous building with nowhere else to be, when a light snapped on across the alley and a small warm glow replaced his window's usual yawning dark. He sat up, walked to the window, peeked out. There she was, a flurry of movement, arranging, unpacking, pulling small, vibrant dresses from large matching suitcases. Her window was so close to him, and she was so close to him, their apartments separated by the distance of a single ambitious jump, that he scooted back a few feet to more fully submerge himself in his darkness. He sat there on his heels and stared for a short while until the staring felt improper and indecent, and he contritely returned to bed. But he has, in the weeks since, come back to the theater of this window, and more often than he'd like to admit. He sometimes sits here, hidden, and for a few minutes at a time, he watches. To say that he finds her beautiful is too simple. Of course he finds her beautiful, objectively, classically, obviously beautiful. Even just the way she walks with a kind of buoyancy, a cheerful, jaunty bounce, has him thoroughly charmed. She glides across the floor of her apartment in thick socks, occasionally doing an impromptu twirl, the skirt of her dress billowing briefly around her. In this drab and filthy place, she prefers dresses, bright flowered sundresses, incongruous amid the grit of the city, the cold of this winter. She tucks her legs under them as she sits in her plush velvet armchair, a few candles glowing nearby, her face impassive and cool, holding a book in one hand, the other hand idly tracing the lip of a wine glass. He watches her touch that glass and wonders how a little fingertip can inspire such a large torment. Her apartment is decorated with postcards from places he assumes she's been: Paris, Venice, Barcelona, Rome. and frame posters of art he assumes she's seen in person: the Statue of David, the Pietà, the Last Supper, Guernica. Her tastes are manifold and intimidating. Meanwhile, he's never even seen an ocean. She reads inordinately at all hours, flicking on her yellow bedside lamp at 2 o'clock in the morning to page through large and unwieldy textbooks: biology, neurology, psychology, microeconomics, or various stage plays, or collections of poetry, or thick histories of wars and empires, or scientific journals with inscrutable names and bland gray bindings. She listens to music he assumes is classical for the way her head sways to it. He strains to identify book jackets and album covers, then rushes to the public library the next day to read all the authors that rouse and unsleep her, and listen to all the symphony she seems to have on repeat: the Hafner, the Eroica, the New World, the Unfinished, the Fantastique. He imagines that if they ever actually speak, he will drop some morsel of symphony fantastique knowledge, and she will be impressed with him and fall in love. If they ever actually speak. She's exactly the kind of person, cultured, worldly, that he came to this frighteningly big city to find. The obvious flaw in the plan, he realizes now, is that a woman so cultured and worldly would never be interested in a guy as uncultured, as provincial, as backward, and coarse as him. Only once has he seen her entertain a guest, a man. She spent an appalling amount of time in her in her bathroom before he arrived, and tried on 6 dresses, finally choosing the tightest one, a purple one. She pulled her hair back, she put on makeup, washed it off, put it back on. She took 2 showers. She looked like a stranger. The man arrived with a 6-pack of beer, and they spent what seemed like an awkward and humorless 2 hours together. Then he left with a handshake. He never came back. Afterward, she changed into a ratty old t-shirt and sat around all evening eating cold cereal in a fit of private sloth. She didn't cry, she just sat there. He watched her across their oxygenless alley, thinking that she was, in this moment, beautiful, though that word beautiful seemed suddenly too narrow to contain the situation. Beauty has both public and private faces, he thought, and it is difficult for one not to annul the other. He wrote her a note on the back of a Chicago postcard: "You would never have to pretend with me." He threw it away and tried again. "You would never have to be someone trying to be someone else." But he didn't send them. He never sends them. Sometimes her apartment is dark, and he goes about his night, his ordinary, hermetic night, wondering where she might be. That's when she's watching him. She sits at her window in the darkness, and he cannot see her. She studies him, observes him, notes his stillness, his tranquility, the admirable way he sits cross-legged on the bed and persistently for hours just reads. He is always alone in there, his apartment a desolate little box of unadorned white walls and a cinder-block bookshelf and a futon condemned to the floor, is not a home that anticipates guests. Loneliness, it seems, holds him like a buttonhole. To say that she finds him handsome is too simple. Rather, she finds him handsome insofar as he seems unaware that he could be handsome. A dark goatee obscuring a delicate baby face, big sweaters disguising a waifish body. His hair is a few years past clean cut and now falls in oily ropes over his eyes and down to his chin. His fashions are fully apocalyptic: threadbare black shirts and black combat boots and dark jeans in urgent need of patching. She's seen no evidence that he owns a single necktie. Sometimes he stands in front of the mirror shirtless, ashen, disapproving. He is so small, short and anemic and skinny as an addict. He survives on cigarettes and the occasional meal, boxed and plastic wrapped and microwavable, usually, or something powdered and rehydrated into borderline edible things. Witnessing this makes her feel as she does while watching reckless pigeons alight on the L's deadly electrified lines. He needs vegetables in his life. Potassium and iron, fiber and fructose, dense, chewy grains and colorful juices, all the elements and elixirs of good health. She wants to wrap a pineapple in ribbon. She'd send it with a note, a new fruit every week. It would say, "Don't do this to yourself." For almost a month, she's watched as tattoos spread ivy-like across his back, now connecting in a riot of pattern and color that's migrating down his slender arms, and she thinks, I could live with that. In fact, there's something reassuring about an assertive tattoo, especially a tattoo that's visible even while wearing a collared work shirt. It speaks to a confidence of personality, she thinks, a person with the strength of his convictions, a person with convictions, contrary to her own everyday inner crisis and the question that's dogged her since moving to Chicago, who will I become? Or maybe more accurately, which of my many selves is the true one? The boy with the aggressive tattoo seems to provide a new way forward, an antidote to the anxiety of incoherence. He's an artist. That much is clear, for he can most often be found mixing paints and solvents, inks and dyes, plucking photo papers out of chemical baths, or leaning over a light box inspecting film negatives through a small, round magnifier. She's amazed at how long he can look. He'll spend an hour comparing just two frames, staring at one, then the other, and then the first one again, searching for the more perfect image. And when he's found it, he circles the frame with a red grease pencil. Every other negative is X'd out, and she applauds his decisiveness. When he chooses a picture or a tattoo or a certain bohemian lifestyle, he chooses devotedly. It is a quality that she, who cannot decide on even the simplest things, what to wear, what to study, where to live, whom to love, what to do with her life, both envies and covets. This boy has a mind calmed by high purpose. She feels like a bean jumping against its pod. He's exactly the kind of person, defiant, passionate, that she came to this remote city to find. The obvious flaw in the plan, she realizes now, is that a man so defiant and passionate would never be interested in a girl as conventional, as conformist, as dull and bourgeois as her. Thus, they do not speak. And the winter nights pass slowly, glacially, the ice coating tree branches like barnacles. All season, it's the same. When his light is off, he is watching her. When her light is off, she is watching him. And on the nights she isn't home, he sits there feeling dejected, desperate, maybe even a little pathetic. And he gazes upon her window and feels like time is zipping away, opportunities gone. Feels like he is losing a race with the life he wishes he could lead. And on the nights he isn't home, she sits there feeling forsaken, feeling once again so bluntly dented by the world, and she examines his window like it's an aquarium, hoping to see some wonderful thing emerge from the gloom. And so here they are, lingering in the shadows. Outside, the snow falls plump and quiet. Inside, they are alone in their separate little studios in their crumbling old buildings. Both their lights are off. They both watch for the other's return. They sit near their windows and wait. They stare across the alley into dark apartments, and they don't know it, but they're staring at each other. Thank you. Thanks. So I wrote that chapter as a short story around 20 years ago. I had just finished my schooling, and I'd moved to New York City. And I was living in this little tiny studio apartment in Queens, and my one window looked across an alley onto a brick window full of other windows, or a brick wall full of other windows. And I had this picture in my mind of two people, kind of young, lonely, like I was at the time, and seeing each other and slowly falling in love. I wrote it as a short story. I sent it off to some literary magazines. It got published somewhere. I was very happy about myself, and then I promptly forgot about it for about 15 years. And then about 15 years later, I had just published my first novel. I was on the lookout for what my second one was going to be, and I remembered that story. And I remember thinking in my 20s that it was fabulously romantic. And then coming back to it many years later in my 40s, happily married for a long time, I looked at these two people and I'm like, they're not romantic, they are idiots, they're constructing these fantasies about the other person that has nothing to do with who that person really is, but they're falling in love with an image. What they're really doing is falling in love with their reflections. They think that the love that the other person is the source of that love, but really they're falling in love with a fantasy of what they want love to be like. And this struck me as potentially an interesting subject to talk about. This was around, 2014, 2015, something like that. And I don't know if you remember, what was going on back then, but it was the right at the moment that people on my Facebook feed started to get kind of weird. Yeah, it was a moment when people started posting some of the strangest things. People that I thought were kind of rational, kind of sensible folks in real life started believing some of the most outrageous things on Facebook and kind of the strange news sites that they were looking at, and it seemed to be that and this is old news now, but back then it was like, wow, some folks just seem to be living in a completely different reality from me, and it was very troubling. And so I thought, well, okay, what about a story about fantasy, about reality, about the stories that we believe in, about how those stories construct our reality, even if the stories aren't quite true. And I thought of this short story, that these two people are creating fantasies about the other person and falling in love with that fantasy. And I thought, well, wouldn't a marriage story, wouldn't a love story, which is full of fantasy, be this interesting Trojan horse for all this other stuff I was thinking about? So I decided to go back to this couple, and I kind of was wondering what would happen. If they got together, if they, started dating, if they got married and had a family and grew up and the world got weird in exactly the way the world got weird, what would have happened to them? So I went back and wrote chapter 2. And so hopefully for you, if you read it, it's seamless from chapter 1 to chapter 2, but for me, there was a 15-year gap between writing those two chapters. And what I decided I wanted to do with this book is to write a book that sort of mimicked the experience that we get to know a spouse or a partner in real life. We get to know our people forwards and backwards at the same time. And what I mean by that is you get to know someone forwards by, you meet them, you go on dates, maybe you move in together, you see how they react to the various things of the world. You get to know them forwards. But then you also get to know them backwards because you meet their friends and you hear the stories, that you weren't around for. You see where they grew up, you meet their parents, and you get to know who they were before you found them. And between those two things, you create a kind of synthesis, like who this person is. And just like, a partner in real life, the better you know them, the more apt they might be to share their darker, more intimate secrets. So I was like, well, how if I try to write a book where that kind of mimics that process? And so this book bops around quite a lot in time. 20 years can pass between chapters, and very slowly over the course of the book, you get to know not only this couple and where they're going right now, and their marriage is kind of in crisis, and they've reached that kind of midlife moment where they're like, okay, I guess this is what life is, and they're I wouldn't say bored, but anxious, about what the next many decades are going to bring, and then we also see where they grew up. We see their families. We see what shaped them in childhood, and hopefully through that, the reader and the other character in the book can come to understand kind of what's going on in the present. There's this image that I chose in the book that there's actually a picture of this in the book, a Polaroid that I took. It's a tree that grows in the Flint Hills in Kansas. Has anybody ever been to the Flint Hills in Kansas? I ask this everywhere, and one? All right. Has anybody heard of the Flint Hills in Kansas? Yeah, it's okay. Most people outside of Kansas haven't. But I went to high school near that part of the country, in Wichita, and to me, it's one of the most beautiful landscapes in the country. Nobody's really heard of it, including the Forest Service that only recently, or the Park Service, sorry, that only recently designated a piece of the Flint Hills as a national park. It's our most recent national park is the Flint Hills, and the reason this place is special is that it's the last tract of tall grass prairie that exists in America. So the tall grass prairie used to exist from basically Chicago to the Rockies and Minnesota down to northern Texas. And that was all turned into agriculture eventually. It was all plowed over and turned into agriculture. But the Flint Hills, you couldn't plow it over because, as the name implies, it's very rocky. There's this layer of chert right underneath the grass that makes it unsuitable for agriculture. So it remains tall grass prairie. And there's this park there, the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, where bison still roam. It's an incredibly beautiful landscape. And the thing about the prairie in that part of the country is that it's really only grass that grows, and that you can look in every direction and not see a single tree. It's the flattest, most uniform landscape that I've ever seen. And the first explorers, like Zebulon Pike and so forth, the first explorers called it the Great American Desert, because they assumed that if no trees can grow anywhere, then it must be worthless, because they were raised on the East Coast. So they were unprepared for this kind of landscape. The thing about the prairie is that it has more life per cubic meter than even the Amazon rainforest. There's a lot going on there. You just have to know how to see it, and most people don't know how to see it. But occasionally on the prairie, there are these trees, usually elms or cottonwoods. There are these trees that will grow, and somehow they'll sprout in the middle of all this grass. And it's a very, very windy part of the country, and so they will grow without being protected from the wind by anything, because they're all alone in the prairie, and they will grow up crooked. They'll be swept, by the southerly winds that shape the place. And so driving around the Flint Hills, you will see the occasional crooked tree, and I've always just loved that. I've always just thought it was very beautiful. I took a picture of one, and that made it into the book, so you can actually see one of these trees. But it struck me as like, the author me, it struck me as quite an interesting metaphor, because these characters, are, as we all are, we are those crooked trees. We are shaped by these very powerful forces our entire lives. We don't know anything about them. We're shaped by cultural forces, historical forces, evolutionary forces, and the forces that shaped us when we were very, very young. Like how we were loved when we were very, very small, in some ways shapes what we expect from love, or how we love when we're older. And so I thought, okay, well, what a great metaphor for this couple, that they've grown up crooked and they don't even know it. I set the book in partly in Kansas, partly in Wicker Park, Chicago. I started going to Chicago, when I was in college. I went to Iowa for undergrad, and we would go to Chicago on weekends, and I would go to Wicker Park. And I remember back in the 90s, I was so in love with all the music coming out of Wicker Park at the time, Liz Phair and Smashing Pumpkins and Urge Overkill. These were my bands, And by the way, it was really humbling recently. I was giving a reading in New York City, and in the autograph line, this young woman said that she loved the 90s part of the book. She was probably maybe 23 years old. She was like, I love the 90s part of the book. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Are you interested in that decade? And she said, no, I just really like historical fiction. That memory is still very like the 90s are still very present for me, that it's now historical. It hurt a little bit, honestly. But I put the couple. I had the meeting. I transposed that first scene from Queens, New York to Wicker Park to Chicago, because I know the city well. I visited there a lot in college, and then my wife and I would travel to Chicago every summer for about 15 years. My wife is a classical musician. She played for the Grant Park Symphony Orchestra, and so Chicago was our summer home for about 15 years, and so I knew the city quite well. And Wicker Park is one of my favorite neighborhoods in the city, and every time I would go back, every summer, I would notice that something had changed in Wicker Park. Like the cool indie video store had become a Doc Martens. The cool vegan cafe had become a Bank of America. Like every summer something would change until suddenly the neighborhood kind of didn't feel like itself anymore. And there was this, kind of layering of time effect as I walked through Wicker Park, because the neighborhood got its start as an industrial area in Chicago in the late 1800s, and then all the factories moved away, and it was kind of abandoned for a very long time, and then it became kind of the heart of the kind of rock and roll bohemian scene in the 90s in Chicago, and then it was gentrified, and now is kind of like the beating heart of the post-industrial sort of information economy in Chicago. And you walk through Chicago, Wicker Park, and you see these things where, this one building in particular, it began its life as a factory, as a sweatshop, and then it became a warehouse, and then it was abandoned for a long time, and then it became it became a coffee shop, and then the set of The Real World when it was based in Chicago that one year, and now it's a gym, and you see this layering of time, and I thought that was kind of. That was kind of interesting. It reminded me of this old story that I love, the story of the ship of Theseus. This story was first told by Plutarch, I think, in one of his histories. And the story goes, the Athenian hero Theseus comes back from his victorious wars, and every year thereafter, the Athenians celebrate his victory by taking his ship for a sail in the harbor. But of course, hundreds of years go by, and every year, some little bit of the ship has to be replaced, an oar, a mast, some of the decking or what have you. And so after hundreds of years of this, every single piece of the ship has been replaced, and yet is it the same ship? And that's the question. Is that ship still the ship of Theseus, even though every single bit of it has been replaced? And it struck me that that neighborhoods can be like that, countries can be like that, marriages can be like that, people can be like that. And so one of the questions that the book asks is how much can something change before it's no longer fundamentally itself? And so that's the question that Jack and Elizabeth, my main two characters, have to wrestle with. Is their marriage, like any long relationship, has changed? And how much can it change before it's no longer fundamentally itself? And what do they do when they reach that crisis point? How much time do I have? How am I doing? Great. So now I'd like to read to you from a little bit 20 years later. 20 years have passed between that Romeo and Juliet bit at the beginning when they fall hopelessly, madly in love with each other as freshmen in college, and now it's 20 years later, and things have changed. Perhaps it was the frequent use of the word forever that made these meetings feel so fraught. As in, this is your forever home, a phrase invoked by builders and designers and architects and real estate agents whenever some costly new extravagance was proposed. The implication was clear. If this is the home you'll die in, maybe go ahead and splurge. Maybe go ahead and buy the real marble tiles rather than the bargain porcelain knockoffs. Maybe buy the actual reclaimed barnwood instead of the replica laminate distressed at the factory. Maybe build those cabinet doors not from cheap MDF, but from a premium exotic like perhaps Ipe. It goes without saying that all parties involved took commissions and kickbacks on these materials, and so there were certain strong incentives vis-a-vis the upselling. Their forever home was a 3-bedroom condo in the northern suburb of Park Shore in a building that would be christened the Shipworks after renovations were complete, so named for its original owner, a long-defunct boat-building company. The Shipworks was currently undergoing a full gut and restoration. The last time Jack had dropped by, the place had been reduced to nothing but its original iron shell. Their future condo was, right now, literally just air. Just a rectangle in the sky, 6 stories up, though that bit of sky was thoroughly defined and demarcated in the loan approval paperwork it had taken many tedious hours to complete. Renters all their adult lives, Jack and Elizabeth were finally becoming homeowners, were finally putting down roots, was how the mortgage broker described it, which Jack quietly resented. He and Elizabeth had met in 1993, and it was now 2014, and he personally thought more than 2 decades in the city meant they were already pretty well rooted, thank you very much. They'd spent a whole afternoon reading and initialing and signing and notarizing loan-related affidavits, after which they were, at last, approved. and they'd celebrated by standing outside the construction fences and toasting what would eventually become the shipworks. They were on the brink of home ownership, buyers of real estate that was not yet technically real, but was circumscribed and plotted with NASA-like precision somewhere within the 400 pages of loan application documents Jack carried under his arm. Signing the papers had felt like an order of magnitude more important than any other single thing they'd ever done. Even getting married, even having a child, required far less documentation and far fewer approvals than securing a mortgage for a condo that did not yet, per se, exist. They stared up at its general location. Jack thought that in previous generations, his job here would have been to scoop up his wife and carry her across the threshold. But of course, there was no threshold, and Elizabeth had no use for time-worn gestures, and anyway, Jack had never been a big enough guy to carry anyone. "We're going to be living right there," he said, pointing at the void their home would soon occupy and inflecting his voice reverently to give the moment its proper gravitas. "Toby will grow up right there." Elizabeth squinted and frowned. "I thought the condo was there," she said, pointing to an entirely different spot in the sky. "Really? I could have sworn it was there." It was the first of many minor disagreements. It turned out that when designing a full home from scratch, there are innumerable unanticipated questions, and Jack surprised himself at how much he cared about all of them. Like, for example, Elizabeth wanted to forego wall cabinets in the kitchen in favor of open shelves, an idea that struck Jack with the force of heresy, even though he had not once in his whole life given any thought to the subject of kitchen cabinetry. "Open shelves," Jack said, appalled. "Yes. You want all our stuff just," he waved his hands vaguely in the air, "out? It would be beautiful. It would be embarrassing. No, look." She fetched her laptop and showed him a photo of such a kitchen. It was one of many hundreds of kitchen photos she'd collected and organized and tabulated, along with dozens of bookmarked web pages and saved YouTube videos. She had, as usual, done her Elizabeth thing, researching and attacking a subject from all possible angles. The photo Jack looked at now showed a kitchen with dark walnut shelves on which white plates and white bowls and white coffee mugs were tastefully stacked and nested among small pieces of whimsical art. It was a kitchen where most everything was either white or wood-toned, where all the dishes matched, where there were no greasy streaks on any surface, where the wide farmhouse sink was clean and empty, and where all the typical kitchen implements, toaster, microwave, coffee maker, had been banished. It was a kitchen that seemed designed more for reflection and meditation than actual food prep. "See," Elizabeth said, "isn't that beautiful?" Jack nodded. "Okay, yeah, very nice," he said, trying to be diplomatic, "but I suspect that has more to do with the $1 million budget than the open shelves specifically." They were sitting at the counter of their small, cluttered Wicker Park kitchen. Its generic sink, water spot stippled and full of the dirty dishes neither he nor Elizabeth ever had much enthusiasm for cleaning. The refrigerator dotted with fingerprints from an 8-year-old who routinely forgot to wash his hands after playing or eating. The toaster atop a rubble of what must have been at least a quarter cup of burnt breadcrumbs. The coffee pot with the more or less permanent bong water-esque haze on its once clear glass. The microwave with its interior red crusty canopy, the result of a generation of exploding tomato sauces. There was such a gap between their lives and the lives of people with open shelves. "Let me offer a quick demonstration," Jack said, whereupon he stood and walked to the upper wall cabinet where they stored all the plastic plates and plastic cutlery and plastic sippy cups amassed during Toby's toddler years, along with the total madness of the Tupperware collection, an agglomeration of eclectically sized plastic containers and their occasionally respective lids, all jammed together so tightly that as soon as Jack opened the cabinet, one of the larger containers fell out and bounced hollowly on the counter as he knew it would. This was followed by a kind of Tupperware cascade, as the pile lost its structural integrity and slid out of the cabinet and all over the floor in what ended up being a way more effective demonstration than Jack could have ever hoped for. He looked at Elizabeth. She stared back at him. She said, "I believe I understand what you're getting at." "What makes you think we could have open shelves?" I said, "I understand." We need to be realistic, Jack said. I mean, do you seriously want all this out for everybody to see? Okay, first, who's everybody? I don't know, guests. When's the last time we had guests? We sometimes have guests. And second, if we had open shelves, it wouldn't look like that, she said, gesturing at the mess on the floor. It would look better. We would be better. Which ended up being the basic philosophical divide between them, whether their new home should reflect their current reality or their future aspirations. Should it be designed based on how they actually lived or how they wanted to live? For Elizabeth, this new condo was a chance for all of them to upgrade, and not only their residence, but their entire modus. She wanted their new home to have, for example, an arts and crafts nook, even though nobody in the family had ever been particularly crafty. And she wanted a rec room for the playing of nostalgic analog-type games like Parcheesi and Uno and Go Fish, even though Toby seemed interested in games only when he was watching other people play them online. And she wanted the new condo to be free of television, even though most nights she fell asleep in front of one. And it was hard for Jack to hear these things and not think that Elizabeth was externalizing all her irritations into the very architecture of their new home, baking her disapproval into the walls of the shipworks. I want a fireplace, she said one night over dinner as they silently ate salads and scrolled through their phones' profuse feeds. A fireplace? He said, looking at her. She nodded. Like this, showing him the photograph on her screen, a picture of an architecture magazine, a middle-aged couple curled up in bed at night, reading books, a crackling fire at their feet. This couple might have been in a log cabin. They might have been in the woods. They had the contented, untroubled expressions of people with well-thought-out retirement plans. I'm not sure that's exactly our style, Jack said. I love it, she said. I want that fireplace. And also, I want to read more. But you read all the time. For pleasure, I mean, not for work. And both of us, you and me, together, I'd like us to read lots more. You think I don't read enough? I'm just saying, doesn't this look nice? Wouldn't this be fun? He set his phone and his fork down, clasped his hands together, stared at her for a moment. Is everything okay? He said. Of course. You're not discontented? I'm fine, Jack. Because it seems like you're discontented. I'm really perfectly fine. It's just all the adjustments you want to make to the new place, the open shelves, the no TV, the game room, your new minimalist aesthetic. What's wrong with my aesthetic? It's just not very recognizably us. It makes it seem like you're maybe unsatisfied, maybe a little unhappy. I'm not unhappy, Elizabeth said, patting him on the arm. Or at least, I'm not abnormally unhappy. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. And we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has a question, I'd be delighted.
If you have a question, please stand and wait for a microphone to come to you.
There's one over there.
Thank you for the beauty and clarity of Wellness. It was a gift to read.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to know what brought you to Naples, Florida, and if you see a Florida setting in your next book.
What brought me to Naples, Florida is, where is she? There she is. There's my wife right over there. Jenny plays the bassoon for the Naples Philharmonic. So she's a classical musician, and you can imagine how many really good bassoon jobs there are in America. She's got this great job at the Naples Philharmonic, and what brought me was that when we first started dating, we actually started dating long distance, and I was living in New York City and she was living in Naples, and we had this deal that whoever got a job at the other place first would move, and I won. I got a job teaching writing at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, and so I moved down to Naples. Moving from New York City to Naples in, I guess that was 2004, was quite a shock. It was like the only place to have a drink after one of her concerts was like the TGI Fridays, you know? So Naples has fortunately has more options these days than it did back then. But yeah, as for whether it's going to show up in a novel someday, Maybe, I don't know. The next one I'm working on is not a Chicago novel. I think it's going to be a Florida novel. I haven't been moved to write about Naples yet because don't laugh. No, simply because like I feel like for a setting to have real kind of rhetorical power for me, there needs to be some gap that I need to cross. So Chicago, was always kind of like the mythical sort of capital of the Midwest, and I grew up all over the Midwest. And I only lived there in the summer, so I would live there for 10 weeks, really, a year. And so there was always this kind of feeling like, well, what if I lived there full time? What would that be like? And so it still retained a kind of mystery to me, whereas the place where I actually live is a little too familiar, so there's no sort of gap for me to cross, no kind of nostalgia for me to be able to like pull from emotionally, and so I didn't find it to be a great setting. But I'm working on a new story that maybe involves pickleball, so so Naples seems much more appropriate for that story. So maybe, I don't know. My novels have a tendency to change. Unlike John Irving, who spoke last night, I do not figure out my endings before I start writing. I find them along the way. So my books tend to change a lot. So don't hold me to that. But that's what I'm thinking right now. Yeah.
Next question.
We have one in the balcony.
Hey, I was wondering, I also really liked wellness, and what is your relationship to social psychology? I know there's a really dominant thread in there with that, and I was wondering both where that came from and whether that chapter where Elizabeth is citing every social psychological study in the past 2 decades was a huge pain in the ass to write.
Thank you for that question. I have no background in psychology, social or otherwise, but I wanted Elizabeth to have that job, and that really came from, that was a decision that really emerged from character. Like most of the decisions in the novel do, like that these two folks, as I said before, like were creating a story about the other person, and they were falling in love with that story rather than falling in love with the person. And it got me thinking about placebo. It got me thinking about the way that placebo is really, it's the body having a physical reaction to symbolic cues. It's a reaction to a story, a good story. And so that sort of emerged from that character, so I decided that I needed to read as much into social psychology, behavior psychology, placebo research, et cetera, as I could to really get it. Musicians have this great way of talking about how they rehearse, that they want to practice something until they have it under their fingers, which kind of means like you can play it without really consciously thinking about it too much. And so I read it until I thought I had it under my fingers. And that chapter, so there's a chapter in Wellness, if you haven't read it, there's a chapter that tries to dramatize 1 hour of toddler childcare, and it's something like 35 pages long. It's just 1 hour. And Elizabeth is the kind of person, Elizabeth is brilliant, and she, I imagine that she would be kind of like a lot of the parents I know. She would be, doing her due diligence, researching best practices for being a good parent. And since she's a psychologist, she would have a kind of mental Rolodex of every, study that would support, any decision that she needed to make as a parent. And the problem with that, of course, is that we all kind of have that, don't we? In our pockets, on our phones, we're just at the end of this fire hose of information. And one of the problems is that we're so overloaded that it's kind of difficult to figure out what's true or what's healthy amidst all of it. And so I decided that when Elizabeth was presented with a child care challenge, she would not only cite the study, but that I decided all those studies should be true. They should all be real studies. If I was trying to make a point about information overload, especially with regards to parents, then it was important for me to make sure that all those studies were true. So yeah, I spent, oh my God, it was a pain in the ass. I spent months, researching this so that every citation, and there are, 100, is all true and real. And so yeah, that was a challenge, but it's not one of my favorite chapters. And if you haven't read it, I won't spoil it for you. But she's facing a problem. She's trying to get Toby to eat, and she cites 100 different studies on how to get Toby to stop being such a picky eater. And then the answer ultimately is kind of drives her a little batty. That what ends up being the solution. So I won't spoil it, but it's one of my favorite bits. But yeah, it took a long time to write and to research. I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you. That's all the time we have.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the day.